Hello. Tonight we're going to be talking more about Immanuel Kant. First, let me apologize. I think that we're getting a little bit behind this week, and there's a lot of material to get through. So I am sorry that we're getting this up late, but we'll be a little bit flexible next week, and I think things will be fine. So we are going to start in our books tonight. Let me see if I can get an image that comes clear. There it is. And we're in the actual text here, so we're starting on page 7. And if you remember last time, we said that we would use the page numbers that are in the margins. And so first we're going to be looking there at 393. We're in the first section, and the very first line is significant, right? He says, there's no possibility of thinking of anything at all in the world, or even out of it, which can be regarded as good without qualification, except a good will. So this is where Kant starts. He says that the only good thing, or the thing that's good without any qualification, is the goodwill. And this is actually the premise from which he's going to develop his whole moral philosophy, right? That the only good thing is the goodwill. Because it is the thing that's good in itself. It is not good for another purpose. It is not good based upon any circumstances in the world, but it is a thing that is good because of its own nature, right? And he does a little bit of work explaining that, right? He says intelligence, wit, judgment, and whatever talents of the mind one might want to name are doubtless in many respects good and desirable, and are as such qualities of temperament as courage, resolution, perseverance. Says, but they can also become extremely bad and harmful if the will, which is to make use of these gifts and of nature, and which in its special constitution is called character, is not good. So the goodwill is what ensures the goodness of other things, right? And he says the sight of a being who is not graced by any touch of a pure and good will, but who yet enjoys an uninterrupted prosperity, can never delight a rational and impartial spectator. Thus, a good will seems to constitute the indispensable condition of being even worthy of happiness. Right? So the goodwill is important because it's not contingent, it's not dependent upon anything. So remember that Kant is going to build a case for a morality that can be understood without its dependence upon circumstances in the world, because circumstances can be variable. Remember, he wants to deduce everything through a priori reasoning, and hence kind of have a mathematics-like understanding of what the moral law is. So he starts with the goodwill, right? And then down towards the bottom of our page there, he says a goodwill is good not because of what it affects or accomplishes, nor because of its fitness to attain some proposed end. It is good only through its willing, that is, good in itself. Right? It's good only in its willing. So he's not in any way a consequentialist. From the very beginning, he's not a consequentialist. He's not saying that the goodwill is good because of what it produces in the world, but it is good in and of itself, and that's important for Kant. Right? And so he gets into a little bit more detail, but we're going to pick up his argument a little bit later. Okay? A little bit later. And he's going to be attacking a little bit the position of Aristotle. So remember, Aristotle sees the goal of human life as happiness, and the virtuous person as the person who's truly happy. And Kant is going to kind of argue against that. And this is on 395 there, right before the 396 there, the paragraph at the bottom of the page 8. It says, in fact, we find that the more cultivated reason devotes itself to the aim of enjoying life and happiness, the further does man get away from true contentment. Right? He says, because of this, there arises in many persons, if only they are candid enough to admit it, a certain degree of misology, that is, hatred of reason. So this is exactly the opposite of what Aristotle would expect to happen, right? And then he continues there on the next page, therefore they come to envy rather than despise the more common run of men who are closer to the guidance of mere natural instinct and who do not allow their reason much influence on their conduct. Right? So what is he noticing? He's noticing that the men who are kind of more involved in this Aristotelian virtue project actually aren't as happy as the men who just don't give much thought to how they're living their lives. That thinking produces the opposite of its intended effect. This really does pose a problem for Aristotle, because Aristotle was insistent that virtue could be known through the application of reason to human behavior. Right? He concludes that paragraph by saying, there lies at the root of such judgments, rather, the idea that existence has another and much more worthy purpose, for which, and not for happiness, reason is quite properly intended, and which must therefore be regarded as the supreme condition to which the private purpose of men must, for the most part, defer. So what is he saying there? He's not questioning reason. He's questioning whether happiness really is the end that we ought to be aiming at, right? So he's going to be counter to the virtue ethicist there. And that's his argument against Aristotle. And then at the bottom of that page, right, kind of where it starts the 397 there, he's going to take up his own argument again. He doesn't give much space to countering the other side. He says, therefore, we shall take up the concept of duty, which includes that of a good will, though with certain subjective restrictions and hindrance, which, far from hiding a good will or rendering it unrecognizable, rather bring it out by contrast and make it shine forth more brightly. So he's going to talk to us first about the concept of duty. So the concept of the goodwill is related to the concept of duty. The concept of duty is where we're going to get our term deontology from. So if you remember from last time, duty is the word deontology is the study of duty, right? That's our study, and duty is going to bring us there, right? Okay. He is going to spend some time investigating what duty is, right? He's going to spend some time investigating what duty is. So he spends some time talking about what duty is not, and then on 398, he says, to preserve one's life is a duty, right? And furthermore, everyone also has an immediate inclination to do so. But on this account, the often anxious care taken by most men, for it has no intrinsic worth, and the maxim of their action has no moral content. They preserve their lives, and to be sure, in accordance with duty, but not from duty. So what is he getting at here? Well, what Kant wants to do is he wants to make sure that the goodwill is what's operative as the motivator for your action, right? And so duty is a one way of helping us to make sure that that's the case. But he wants to make sure that the action that he's talking about, or the action in question is, it needs to be a response to duty and not to some other inclination. So he gives this example of the preservation of one's life. We do have a duty to preserve our life, but when we take actions to preserve our life, right, and these could be simple or complex things, right? One of the actions that we take to preserve our life is, having dinner, right? Because if we don't have dinner, then, we will become malnourished or whatever. So it doesn't have to be a complex thing. And perhaps in the simple day-to-day activities, the things that we do that are in accordance with the duty of preserving our life are really actually good examples, right? Because they include things like, eating and drinking and sleeping and, washing, buckling our seatbelt in the car, things like that. Really simple activities that can have other kinds of motivators, right? So it's not that it's motivated from duty necessarily, even though it's in accord with duty. It could be motivated from inclination instead of duty. And this is a problem for Kant. It's not a problem that we do things out of inclination. It's a problem that if we're doing things out of inclination, then we don't know that we're doing it from the goodwill. And the goodwill is the only thing that's good. And so that needs to be the motivator of our action if our action is going to be moral, right? So this is the quandary. How do we know if we're acting from the goodwill or not? On page 11, or this is a continuation of 398 with the margin numbers, right? He says, to be beneficent where one can is a duty. So what does it mean to be beneficent? It means to be a benefactor, to be good to people, to give things, right? He says, and besides this, there are many persons who are so sympathetically constituted that without any further motive of vanity or self-interest, they find an inner pleasure in spreading joy around them and can rejoice in the satisfaction of others as their own work. But I maintain that in such a case, an action of this kind, however dutiful and amiable it may be, has nevertheless no true moral worth. It is on a level with such actions as arise from other inclinations. For example, the inclination for honor. So, what is Kant getting at? He's getting at that, and this is exactly the opposite of what Aristotle had said. Aristotle would say that if you're finding pleasure in doing the right thing, that is the virtuous life. Kant thinks that if you're finding pleasure in doing the right thing, then there's no moral worth there, because you're acting out of inclination and you're not acting from the goodwill, right? You're not acting from the goodwill. Let's proceed a little bit down the page here, right, where he says, suppose, then, that the mind of a friend of mankind to be clouded over with his own sorrow, so that all sympathy with the lot of others is extinguished. And suppose him still to have the power to benefit others in distress, even though he is not touched by their trouble, because he is sufficiently absorbed with his own. And now, suppose that even though he has no inclination that moves him any longer, he nevertheless tears himself from this deadly insensibility and performs the action without any inclination at all, but solely from duty. then for the first time his action has genuine moral worth, right? That's the only motivator that is really any good at all is the goodwill, right? It's the goodwill. And so we are going to have some difficulty then in being able to articulate our moral principles, right? Because what we have come up with is this idea that the only good motivator is the goodwill, but we don't know whether or not we're acting from inclination or from the goodwill. So we need to come up with a way to figure that out. We need to be able to figure out if we are acting from duty or if we are acting from inclination. So this is the first great big problem of Kant. And this is the problem that he's going to solve in the first section of our text. The question of whether or not we are acting from duty or we are acting from the inclination of will. And so he spends a few pages talking about the problem, right? He spends a few pages talking about the problem before he's able to, really solve it, right? Before he's able to really solve it. And he comes up with a few principles, right? One of them is an action done from duty has its own moral worth, and not in the purpose that is to be obtained by it, but in the maxim according to which the action is determined, right? So this is on 399 at the end, keep using the margin numbers and using the page numbers. It's the bottom of page 12 and the top of page 13, right? So an action done from duty has its own moral worth, and the value is according to the maxim of the action, right? So what is a maxim? It's a principle. So there's an abstraction here that you have to act according to a principle, and it's the principle that's going to give the moral worth to your action, not the result of the action or any inclination associated with the action. And then down that page, this is on 400, he has another principle. It says, duty is the necessity of an action done out of respect for the law. Right? And that's very close to the same thing. That's very close to the same thing. An action done out of respect for the law, because that's the moral law, and that's the worth that it's going to have. Right? And then on 402, this is our page 14, there's a critically important paragraph where he's going to really advance the argument. He asks, what sort of law can be the thought of which must determine the will without reference to any expected effect? Right? So without reference to an expected effect, right? Because then that's not the goodwill. The goodwill doesn't have an expected effect. It's good in itself. So without reference to an expected effect, what sort of law can we think of so that the will can be called absolutely good without qualification? Now, this is a challenge, right? So what we want to know is how we can call the will good without qualification according to a law, according to a maxim or a universal principle that doesn't reference the result expected, right? Because then that preserves the goodness of the will, right? He says, since I have deprived the will of every impulse that might arise for it from obeying any particular law, there is nothing left to serve the will as principle except the universal conformity of its actions to the law as such. So the law, or the law, because it can't look to an expected result, it can't be consequentialist in its concept, has to look to the nature of itself as law to find its principle, right? And so you want to look to what is the nature of law, because the nature of law itself is the only thing that can motivate the goodwill, right? And so he comes to this principle, right? He says, that is, I should never act except in such a way that I can also will that my maxim should become a universal law, right? I should never act in such a way except that I can also will that my maxim can become a universal law. So this is the law that he's coming up with, that is going to be the principle that assures us that we're acting from duty and not from inclination, because it depends in itself only on the concept of what the law is, and that is universality. Okay? And let me say this again. I should never act except in such a way that I can also will that my maxim should become a universal law. That's the principle. Here, he continues, mere conformity to such a law without having as its basis any law determining particular actions serves the will as a principle, and must so serve it if duty is not to be a vain delusion and a chimerical concept. Right? This is his principle, that you can only act in accordance with those maxims that you can at the same time will to be a universal law. So right away, he is going to kind of see how this is going to work as an example, right? He says, for example, take this question: when I am in distress, may I make a promise with the intention of not keeping it, right? This is his question. If he is in distress, can he make this promise? I think that most of us think that we can, right? That if you're in distress, you can make a false promise. We have exceptions to this in the law itself, that if you're under duress, it's understood that you don't even have to mean what you say, right? But he continues, right? I readily distinguish here the two meanings of which the question may have, whether making a false promise conforms with prudence or with duty. Doubtless the former can often be the case, right? So the form of prudence. It can often conform with prudence. And remember that prudence is a virtue, right? Indeed, I clearly see that the escape from some present difficulty by means of such a promise is not enough. In addition, I must carefully consider whether from this lie there may arise far greater inconvenience for me than from what I now try to escape. Furthermore, the consequences of my false promise are not easy to foresee, even with all my supposed cunning. Loss of confidence in me might prove to be far more disadvantageous than misfortune, which I now try to avoid. Right? He says the more prudent way might be to act according to a universal maxim and make it a habit not to promise anything without intending to keep it. Right? So he's still talking about prudence here. Right? But that such a maxim is nevertheless always based on nothing but fear of consequences, and it becomes clear to me at once. To be truthful from duty is, however, quite different than being truthful from fear of disadvantageous consequences. right? And then he continues later, said, the most direct and infallible way, however, to answer the question as to whether a lying promise accords with duty is to ask myself whether I would really be content if my maxim, right? The maxim is extricating yourself from difficulty by means of a false promise, were to hold as a universal law for myself as well as others, right? This is the test, right? It's not a question of prudence. It's a question of, is the maxim of my action, can I will it also to be a universal law, right? And he continues, he says, could I really say to myself that everyone may promise falsely when he finds himself in difficulty from which he can find no other way to extricate himself? He says, then I immediately become aware that I can indeed will the lie, but I cannot at all will a universal law to lie. For by such a law, there would really be no promises at all, since in vain would my willing future actions be professed to other people, who would not believe what I professed, or if they over hastily did believe, then they would pay me back in like coin. Therefore my maxim would necessarily destroy itself as soon as it was made a universal law. Right? Do we get what he's saying? Let's put it this way. The only reason you ever make a promise is because you have reasons to break it, or because there are foreseen reasons why you might break it, right? So when do we make promises? Well, we make promises when we do things like take out a loan. And the reason why we have to make those promises is because there is a reason to believe that we might have other motivations to not pay back the loan, right? If that's why we have to make a promise. We make promises when we get married. And the reason why we make promises when we get married is because you were foreseeing that you might have a reason not to keep that promise later on. But if my maxim were universalized, such that a person could make a false promise when they were in distress, and that everybody would naturally be expected to do that, well, then there would be no such thing as a promise, right? People would act in accordance with their inclination, regardless of whatever it was they said, right? And so to will to universalize my maxim of false promises would be to will the elimination of promises in the first place, or the elimination even of truthful speech, because there would be no reason to ever expect that somebody's speech, that whatever it is that they were saying, could be true or false. It'd be equally as likely to be true as it would be to be false. Well, then meaningful communication is eliminated. And so this is the moral law. Can you will to universalize the maxim of your action? And so what Kant is saying here in his example is that maybe prudence could come up with a reason. Maybe prudence can't. It doesn't matter. The goodwill that is occupied with its own goodness, right, can't will to universalize the maxim. And so we know that it is not going to be a moral act to make a false promise. Okay? And this really is the end of the first section. Right? This is the end of the first section, where he gets to this point, right, where he's got the goodwill. The goodwill is the only good thing because it's good in itself. And that's connected with duty, because duty reveals what the goodwill is. When we act in accordance with duty, we're acting in accordance with what the goodwill is. But then there arises the problem. Can we tell if we're acting from duty or if we're acting from inclination? If we're acting from inclination, that's not morally praiseworthy activity. It's only morally praiseworthy if we're acting in accordance with duty and not acting in accordance to inclination. How do we determine that? Well, we determine that if we're acting in accordance with the law. But how can we determine what the law is for the goodwill when we can't talk about the expected consequence of the action, right? If we're trying to articulate a law that is not dependent upon the consequence that's expected from the action, but only relates to the nature of law itself, the nature of law is universal, right? So the principle of human action, the principle of morality, is you must always act such that you can will you must always act such that you may also at the same time will that the maxim of your action become a universal law. Right? In the next section, we are going to talk about how this principle is developed into what Kant is going to call the categorical imperative. And we're going to have some more examples. Okay, and that will be the subject of the third lecture on Kant, which should be available sometime like 24 hours or so after this one.